Greetings, students. Mr. Little here. And today on History Bites, we're going to look at the economic growth of Europe. And this is Chapter 19, Part 2. By the end of this History Bite, you should be able to answer the following essential questions. How did the changing ecological conditions impact the economic situation of Europe? How do trade organizations like the Hanseatic League and the Venetian trade routes represent a fundamental change in the economic situation of Europe? And how did the economic change impact the political structures of feudalism within Europe? So let's really quick talk about these ecological changes. So several factors went into the increase in agriculture during this time. So for example, Europe had been predominantly forest for a very long time. You may be aware that a lot of fairy tales that have their origins in Europe usually involve a forest. That is because for a very long time, Europe was predominantly forest. However, during this time, we begin to see wide-scale deforestation in the name of getting farmland or cropland or grazing land. We continue to see the expansion of the iron plow, spreading out further and being used more. We see the introduction of something called the three-field system, which allows for a larger yield via crop diversification. So you have three pieces of land, and you'll grow different crops on each of them, and then you will rotate those crops every year so that the soil does not wear out. Some crops are soil recharging crops, and some crops are not. You also have new crops that simply enrich the diet of Europeans, such as citrus from the Mediterranean, heavier grains of wheat from North Africa, as well as the introduction of spinach from the Islamic world. All of this led to a major population rebound between 1000 and 1300 CE. And this, of course, leads to urbanization and interregional trade. That is the growth of cities and the beginning of interregional exchange. And of course, this leads to increasing production of manufactured goods, as now more people are alive that can work in cities and create those beautiful manufactured goods. This, of course, corresponds with new trade practices. And if this seems familiar, it's because we have seen this being practiced in other parts of the world during this time. So, for example, we begin to see the rise of contemporary banks, such as the Medici Bank in the northern Italian peninsula, which loaned out money to merchants. We also see the rise of guilds or associations of craftsmen in the major medieval towns. Guilds would bring their members together, and they would regulate the quality of goods as well as the number of goods and who was allowed to buy the goods. And so guilds and their appearance represented a rebound in manufacturing and productivity. And there was a guild for pretty much every single craft or product you could think of. Beer making, leather tanning, wood carving, every craft had a guild. Outside of the medieval towns, you begin to see the rise of trade fairs, the most famous of which was the Champagne, which brought together buyers and sellers. You had buyers coming from Italy with money from all of their trade in the Mediterranean, wanting to buy goods from Northern Europe, such as wool or animal skins or wood. And these trade fairs brought together the buyers and the sellers. And this allowed for increased interregional interaction. Now, in the Mediterranean, that is in Southern Europe, these northern Italian cities were beginning to take on trade with the rest of the Mediterranean world, aka the Islamic world and the Byzantine Empire. And these Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa and Pisa began to become the main source of imported luxuries across Europe. And so if you wanted spices from the East, if you wanted sandalwood from Southeast Asia or pepper, you would have to go through these Italian city-states because they were the ones doing business with the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world, specifically Egypt. And so these cities were bringing in the goods from outside of Europe, and their rise in wealth from all of this led that they also wanted goods from within Europe. And so, for example, the merchants in Venice and the other Italian city-states continue to buy wool and animal skins from Northern Europe, bring them south, and produce beautiful textiles, which they then took and sold elsewhere. And so the increasing trade in the Italian city-states had a ripple effect of increasing trade in other parts of Europe. However, these were not the only trading groups at this time. There was also the interesting case of something called the Hanseatic League. Now, the Hanseatic League is a group of commercial merchant guilds in market towns across Northern Europe. A couple of very famous cities, including London, Hamburg, and even Moscow for a short time, were Hanseatic cities. But what this was it was a group of cities, and each one would make deals with the others, and they would do things like protect themselves from pirates. They would decide on how much to sell and where, and they would promote local manufacturing between regions. So, for example, the cities in the east, such as Moscow and the other cities in that part of the league, would import pelts from Siberia, and they would trade those pelts for manufactured goods from England, such as textiles or ironworking. And so this was kind of a local interregional trade in Northern Europe. And some of their goods did find their way south into the Mediterranean. But the Hanseatic League is interesting in that it's a localized trade network in Northern Europe. And this had its day and sort of started to decline when European states started to simply do this trade themselves, and you didn't need a league to do it for you. But nonetheless, this league was important because it promoted local manufacturing within a region and is further evidence of a general revival of economic activity. Now, all of this growth in trade and cities and manufacturing leads to the question of feudalism, right? Because if feudalism was the order of the day, peasants working on land for the lords, doesn't this mean this upended feudalism? And to a certain extent, it did. Peasants migrated, or in some cases, just ran away from their lords to live in the cities. And cities oftentimes lobbied kings directly to say, hey, we're a rich city. We don't want to be under the control of some local lord. Can we be directly under the control of the king? And so this gives rise to something called the free cities, which you begin to see across the Holy Roman Empire and a number of other places. Cities that pay their taxes directly to the king and not to the local lord. So the growth of trade and urbanization did disrupt feudalism to a small extent. However, manufacturing did not replace agriculture, and the lords of various kingdoms still held the right to the land, and kings would still rely on their lords to raise armies until the widespread adoption of gunpowder technology in the late 1600s. So feudalism may have been on the decline, but it was not going away anytime soon, just because a couple of Italian cities were doing some more trade than normal. So I hope you have enjoyed this bite of history with me. You should be able to answer those two essential questions from the opening slides, and I'll see you next time.